She needed my money, but not my presence. Then the wedding deposit deadline arrived. At 51, when my daughter whispered those soul-crushing words, "It was just as family, Mom. You wouldn't fit in," I felt something inside me die and be reborn simultaneously. A week later, when she called me in absolute panic screaming, "Mom, the deposit for the venue bounced." That phone call became the symphony of a carefully constructed fantasy world colliding with the brutal, unforgiving reality of a bank statement that would never lie. For my daughter, Victoria, it was complete catastrophe, the end of her perfect world. For me, it was a boundary carved in stone. The moment I stopped being a 24/7 human ATM machine and remembered I was a woman who deserved not just basic respect, but genuine love and inclusion in my own daughter's life. This wasn't some impulsive, heat-of-the-moment decision born from wounded pride. This was the final, mathematically logical step in a long, excruciatingly painful education about my new designated place in Victoria's meticulously curated existence. I'm Elizabeth Harrison, and let me tell you, after 3 decades of believing unconditional love meant unconditional giving, I learned the hardest lesson of my life. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who can destroy us most completely, and sometimes saving yourself means letting them face the consequences of their choices. For 28 years, Victoria and I weren't just mother and daughter, we were an unbreakable team, two souls welded together by tragedy and triumph. Her father, my beloved Marcus, was taken from us by a massive heart attack when she was 14, a sudden, devastating blow that could have shattered us both. Instead, it forged us into something stronger. We navigated the treacherous waters of grief together, survived the turbulent storms of her teenage years as partners, and celebrated every milestone from her high school graduation to her college acceptance as a united front of two. I poured every ounce of my being into that extraordinary girl. When Marcus died, I made decisions that would define the next decade of our lives. I sold the sprawling suburban home he and I had built together, every room echoing with memories of our dreams, and downsized to a modest but elegant townhouse. Every penny from that sale, every dollar I could scrape together, went into transforming my small catering business from a weekend hobby into a thriving, respected enterprise that employed 12 people and catered to the city's most prestigious events. Every 16-hour workday, every missed social event, every sacrifice I made was for her. I wanted Victoria to have choices I never had, opportunities that would open doors to a world beyond anything I could have imagined. I put her through Stanford University without her ever having to glimpse the inside of a financial aid office or sign a single student loan document. Our relationship was built on an unshakable foundation of shared history, mutual respect, and approximately 1,000 inside jokes that could make us both dissolve into helpless laughter even during our darkest moments. Then Victoria met Sebastian Wellington. Sebastian was, on the surface, everything any mother could dream of for her daughter. He was devastatingly handsome with the kind of effortless sophistication that comes from generations of breeding, impeccably dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. And he came from a family that didn't just have money, they had their own private airport and a family crest that predated the Revolutionary War. The Wellingtons were old money in the most intimidating sense of the phrase. Their wealth was whisper quiet, spanning 7 generations, and wrapped in layers of impenetrable social armor that made Fort Knox look welcoming. To the Wellingtons, my thriving catering business, the empire I had built with my own bleeding hands and sleepless nights, was dismissed as a charming little hobby. My beautifully appointed townhouse, which I had lovingly renovated room by room, was cozy in that tone that somehow made the word sound like an insult. My entire life, built on hard work, determination, and self-sufficiency, was to them quaint but ultimately unserious, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. The matriarch of this dynasty, Constance Wellington, was a master sculptor of backhanded compliments. I'll never forget the first time we met at their country club, where I had brought an elaborate spread of my finest catered delicacies. She examined my presentation with the clinical detachment of a museum curator studying a questionable artifact. "Oh, Elizabeth," she said, her voice dripping with a kind of condescension that had been perfected over generations, "it's just so wonderful that you have something to keep you busy." The unspoken addendum hung in the air like expensive perfume, unlike us, who are busy being important and relevant. I could handle Constance Wellington. I had dealt with women like her my entire professional life, clients who thought money gave them the right to treat service providers like well-dressed servants. I smiled with practiced grace, maintained my dignity, and held my ground with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. What I couldn't handle, what slowly began to destroy me from the inside out, was watching the gradual but unmistakable transformation of my daughter. The girl who used to call me 5 times a day just to share random thoughts now let my calls go straight to voicemail. The daughter who used to raid my closet and wear my clothes like they were designer pieces now made subtle but cutting remarks about my appearance. "Mom," she'd say with a little wrinkle of distaste creasing her perfect nose, "no one really wears that brand anymore. Maybe we should go shopping and update your wardrobe to something more current." It started with microscopic suggestions that were actually surgical strikes against my confidence. She began to see me through the Wellington's crystal clear lens of judgment. I was no longer the strong, capable, inspiring mother she had always admired and sought advice from. I had somehow transformed into a slightly embarrassing, middle-class obstacle standing between her and her glossy new life of privilege and social acceptance. The engagement announcement, when it finally came, arrived via a group text message, not even a personal call. A photograph of a diamond ring so massive it could have been seen from space, sitting on Victoria's finger with the caption, "I said yes. Can't wait to start this new chapter." I had to call her to offer my congratulations, and even then she seemed distracted, already mentally planning a wedding that I was apparently expected to fund but not truly participate in. The wedding planning began almost immediately, and it became crystal clear from the very first conversation that I was expected to play the role of silent financier, not collaborative partner. The Wellingtons had endless opinions about every detail, from the color of the tablecloths to the variety of roses in the centerpieces, but they certainly had no intention of opening their ancient, carefully guarded checkbooks to pay for any of their grandiose visions. The venue selection became the first major battlefield in what would become an all-out war for Victoria's soul. Constance casually mentioned over afternoon tea that her niece had been married at the Grandview estate, a breathtakingly expensive historical mansion with manicured gardens that had hosted presidents and foreign dignitaries. Anything less, she implied with surgical precision, would be a bit of a disappointment for someone of Sebastian's social standing. Victoria seized on this suggestion like it was a life preserver in stormy seas. It was perfect, it was elegant, it was exactly what the Wellingtons expected, and most importantly, it would prove beyond any doubt that she belonged in their world. The venue also cost more than Marcus had earned in 2 years of teaching high school chemistry, but I saw the desperate hope burning in Victoria's eyes, the need to prove she was worthy of their acceptance. So, like a fool blinded by maternal love, I agreed. I told her I would cover the venue and the catering, my wedding gift to her, a massive, financially devastating gift that would require me to mortgage my business and liquidate my retirement savings. I signed the initial contract and paid the preliminary deposit of $15,000. The much larger, completely non-refundable final deposit of $90,000 was due in 3 months. Then came the engagement party, and with it, the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my daughter. I only discovered the party had happened because Priscilla, one of the Wellingtons' more social media-obsessed cousins, had posted what felt like hundreds of photographs across every platform imaginable. There was Victoria, absolutely radiant in a designer gown that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, standing in the center of the Wellingtons' perfectly manicured botanical gardens. She was surrounded by dozens of smiling, beautifully dressed people who looked like they had stepped out of a magazine spread about how the other half lives. There were champagne towers that sparkled like crystal monuments, string quartets playing classical pieces I recognized from my own wedding, and tables laden with delicacies from the city's most exclusive caterer. The whole scene looked like something from a fairy tale, complete and perfect in every detail. Except for one glaring absence. Me, I wasn't just not invited, I had been completely erased from my own daughter's most important milestone, as if I had never existed at all. I waited 24 hours for my initial rage to cool, for the raw, visceral hurt to settle into something I could manage without completely falling apart. I practiced what I would say, how I would keep my voice steady and reasonable. Finally, I called her. "Victoria, honey," I said, fighting to keep my voice even and non-accusatory. I saw the pictures from the engagement party online. It looked absolutely beautiful. "You look stunning." There was a telling pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that speaks volumes about guilt and calculation. "Oh," she said, her voice suddenly small and defensive. "Yeah, it was. It was really nice. Sebastian's family knows how to throw a party." I waited, giving her the opportunity to explain, to provide some reasonable explanation for my exclusion. When none came, I forced myself to ask the question that was tearing me apart from the inside. "I was just wondering," I said, each word feeling like broken glass in my throat, "why I wasn't there." She let out a sigh, the sound of someone who had been caught in a lie and was annoyed at having to explain herself. And then she delivered the line that would change everything between us forever, the words that would haunt me for months to come. "It was just his family, Mom," she murmured, her voice carrying a casual, devastating cruelty that I had never heard from her before. "You wouldn't fit in. It would have been awkward." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't hang up the phone in dramatic fury. Instead, a strange, cold calm washed over me like ice water in my veins. In that moment, everything became crystal clear with the sharp focus that comes from absolute clarity. I finally understood my role in this elaborate performance. I was the walking, talking bank account, good enough to fund the party, but not good enough to attend it. My presence was an embarrassment, but my money was a necessity. I could see the rest of my life stretching out before me like a prison sentence, a series of events I would be expected to pay for but politely excluded from, all for the sake of maintaining appearances in front of people who would never accept me. I saw myself relegated to the role of the dowdy, out-of-place mother-in-law, a necessary evil to be tolerated at holidays, a checkbook to be called upon when needed but otherwise kept at a respectful distance. And in that moment of perfect clarity, I made a decision that would change everything. "Okay, honey," I said, my voice eerily serene. "I understand perfectly." And I did. I understood with the kind of clarity that comes from having your heart broken so completely that you have no choice but to see the truth. After that phone call, something fundamental shifted inside me, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves after an earthquake. The warm, maternal instinct to give Victoria the world was replaced by a cool, rational sense of self-preservation. My grief over the loss of our closeness hardened into a quiet, unshakable resolve. I didn't call her back to argue or fight for my place in her life. I didn't send her long text messages explaining how much she had hurt me. Pleading for my own daughter's affection felt like the ultimate defeat, a humiliation I refused to endure. Instead, I did something far more powerful: nothing. I simply agreed to the terms she had set for our relationship. I was not family. Therefore, I had no familial obligations. The logic was as clean and cutting as her dismissal had been. For the next 3 weeks, Victoria acted as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just systematically excluded me from one of the most important events of her life. She'd text me pictures of flower arrangements and bridesmaid dresses, completely oblivious to the chasm she had opened between us. My responses were polite but minimal. "Nice. Lovely. Great choice." I imagined she interpreted my emotional distance as me being in a temporary sulk, a petty mood I would eventually get over, especially with the massive deposit deadline looming on the horizon. She had no concept of a world in which my money was not unconditionally hers. The idea that my financial support might be directly linked to her emotional support was a connection her entitlement made her completely blind to. In her mind, I existed to fund her dreams, regardless of how she treated me. In my home office, I kept a thick, white binder labeled Victoria and Sebastian's Wedding. For months, it had been my part-time job, a labor of love that consumed my evenings and weekends. I had spent countless hours negotiating with vendors, comparing contracts, managing timelines, and coordinating details. I had poured my heart, my professional expertise, and my maternal devotion into planning what I believed would be the perfect day for her. I opened the binder and looked at the tab marked Venue. There was the contract for the Grandview estate, with its staggering figures and its pages of legal clauses. And tucked into the front pocket was the cashier's check I had written out 5 days before that life-changing phone call. It was a cashier's check for $90,000 made out to the Venue, sitting on my desk and waiting to be mailed. Staring at that check, I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. That piece of paper wasn't just money. It was my daughter's entry fee into the Wellington dynasty. It was the price of her happiness, or what she believed was her happiness. It was also the price of my dignity, and I was no longer willing to pay it. With a steady hand, I took the check and placed it carefully in a folder at the back of my personal filing cabinet, the one labeled Future Investments. Because that's what this was now, an investment in my own future, my own happiness, my own sense of self-worth. The silence from me was a strategic choice, not an emotional reaction. I knew the final deposit for the estate was due on a specific Friday in November. I also knew that Patricia, the venue coordinator, was a consummate professional who would not let that deadline pass without making several phone calls. My only job was to wait and prepare for what was coming. But I wasn't just waiting passively. I was planning the next chapter of my life. That $90,000, which was no longer earmarked for champagne toasts and wedding cake, suddenly felt like a liberation fund. For years, I had put my own dreams on hold. Marcus and I had always talked about buying a small house on the coast, a quiet place to escape the city's chaos, a place where we could watch sunsets and grow old together. After he died, pursuing that dream alone had felt too painful, too much like admitting he was really gone forever. But now it felt like a lifeline to a future I had forgotten I wanted. I spent the next 2 weeks in a whirlwind of secret activity that felt more exciting than anything I had done in years. I drove up the coast every other day, meeting with real estate agents and walking through charming little houses that smelled of salt air, old wood, and infinite possibilities. I found cottage after cottage that spoke to my soul in ways the Grandview estate never could. And then I found it a small, weathered cedar cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean with a wild, overgrown garden that bloomed with native plants and a massive stone fireplace that had warmed families for generations. It was everything the Wellingtons' world was not. It was real, it was unpretentious, and it would be mine. I made an offer that same afternoon, and it was accepted within hours. The $90,000 wouldn't cover the entire purchase, of course, but it was the perfect, substantial down payment that made the dream not just possible, but inevitable. The closing date was scheduled for a Monday in early December. The Friday before that Monday was the deadline for the Grandview estate deposit. The poetic justice was not lost on me. On that Friday morning, I sat in my lawyer's office, signing the final documents for my cottage while Patricia from the Grandview estate left increasingly frantic voicemails on my phone. My phone was on silent in my purse, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. I was no longer a supporting character in the grand production of Victoria's wedding to the Wellingtons. I was the lead actress in my own story again, and it felt absolutely liberating. As I drove home with the keys to my new life heavy and wonderful in my pocket, I turned my phone back on. There were 4 missed calls from the Grandview estate, 2 from a number I didn't recognize, and 1 from Victoria. I decided to let the next call come through. "Mom! What the hell is going on?" Victoria's voice was shrill, a high-pitched shriek of pure panic that I had never heard from her before. "Patricia from the estate just called me." She said the final deposit was never sent. She said they're going to release our date to another couple if they don't get a wire transfer for $90,000 in the next hour. Did you forget to mail the check? Please tell me this is some kind of mistake. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement in her voice was breathtaking in its audacity. There was no apology for her cruelty, no acknowledgement of the engagement party, no recognition that she had treated me like a second-class citizen in my own daughter's life. There was only the panicked assumption that my entire existence revolved around her wedding and that any deviation from her plans must be an error on my part. No, Victoria, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand during a critical operation. It's not a mistake. And I didn't forget anything. I simply chose not to send it. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the phone line, the sound of a world grinding to a halt. I could practically picture her brain trying to process a reality it was not equipped to handle, like a computer trying to run software it didn't have the capacity for. "What?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean you chose not to?" "You can't do that. You promised. Everything is booked. The flowers, the photographer, the string quartet, 300 guests of invitations. The menu has been finalized. Everything depends on the venue." "I'm sure it does," I said, allowing a hint of steel to enter my tone. "And I'm sure Sebastian and his family can pool their considerable resources and sort it out. They seem very capable of handling complex social situations." "We don't have $90,000 just lying around," she shrieked, her panic escalating into full-blown hysteria. "Sebastian's money is all tied up in trust funds. My salary from the gallery is basically nothing. You have the money, Mom. You have to pay it. You're completely ruining my life. This is insane." The accusation, so profoundly selfish and utterly devoid of self-awareness, was the final confirmation that I had made the right decision. "Let's be very clear about something, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping to a low, serious register that commanded attention. "I promised to help my daughter with her wedding. But 3 weeks ago, you made it crystal clear that your priority was his family, and I'm quoting you directly here, one in which I wouldn't fit in. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot treat me like an unwelcome outsider and then expect me to finance the party you excluded me from. You drew the boundary lines, Victoria, not me. I am simply respecting the parameters you established for our relationship." I could hear her sputtering on the other end, a torrent of accusations and desperate, tearful pleas tumbling over each other. She called me selfish, vindictive, cruel, manipulative. In the background, I could hear the sharp, imperious voice of Constance Wellington demanding to know what was happening, followed by what sounded like several people talking at once in increasingly panicked tones. It was a spectacular display of the very drama and chaos they had been so keen to avoid by excluding me. "I have to go now, Victoria," I said, pulling into my driveway and looking up at the townhouse that had been my sanctuary. "I have some packing to do." "Packing? What are you talking about? You have to fix this. You have to send the money right now." "No," I said, and for the first time in the conversation, I allowed a small note of satisfaction to creep into my voice. "I don't have to do anything. And as for that deposit money," I continued, delivering what I knew would be the final, crushing blow, "I'm sure his family is more than capable of handling it. After all, you seem to think they're a perfect fit for everything else in your life." I hung up the phone, turned it off completely, and left it in the car. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in months. The aftermath, which I pieced together later from a series of increasingly desperate voicemails and a very uncomfortable call from my sister who had somehow gotten dragged into the drama, was even more satisfying than I had imagined. The wedding, of course, was a complete and utter disaster that would be talked about in social circles for years to come. The Wellingtons, for all their generational wealth and social connections, were either unable or unwilling to produce that amount of liquid cash on a Friday afternoon. They lost the Grandview estate and spent the weekend in a frantic, humiliating series of phone calls, trying to relocate the entire event with less than 2-month notice. They ended up in the bland, soulless ballroom of a chain hotel near the airport, the kind of place that hosted corporate conferences and high school reunions. The original caterer, whose contract was specifically with the Grandview estate, refused to work at the new venue on such impossibly short notice. They were stuck with generic hotel catering, rubbery chicken, overcooked vegetables, and sheet cake instead of the seven-tier masterpiece Victoria had planned. The string quartet canceled when they learned about the venue change. The photographer, who specialized in outdoor garden weddings, was completely unprepared for the fluorescent-lit hotel ballroom. Constance Wellington was reportedly mortified beyond words. The guests were confused and disappointed. Victoria, according to my sister, cried through the entire makeshift ceremony, her designer dress looking out of place against the hotel's beige carpeting and drop ceiling tiles. The perfect, curated image she had been willing to sacrifice her own mother for had dissolved into a chaotic, embarrassing farce that would follow her in social circles for decades. Meanwhile, I was 200 miles up the coast, standing on the deck of my new cottage with a glass of wine in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold that no wedding planner could ever recreate. The only sounds were the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore and the cry of seagulls overhead. I thought of Victoria, and for the first time in months, I felt not anger or sadness, but a quiet, cleansing sense of peace. She had gotten exactly what she asked for, a wedding free of the mother who wouldn't fit in. And in doing so, she had lost the one person who would have moved mountains for her, who would have given her anything and everything, who had already given her everything and asked for nothing in return except basic love and respect. I raised my glass to the horizon, to the new life stretching out before me like an endless ocean of possibilities. I had been uninvited from a single day in her life. In return, I had invited myself to the rest of mine, and it was going to be absolutely beautiful.